I still remember the exact moment I handed her the envelope. It was a Tuesday morning, and the air in Quezon City was thick and warm the way it always is in July, the kind of heat that settles into your chest and makes everything feel slower, heavier, more deliberate. I had counted out the bills the night before, sitting alone in my rented apartment with the ceiling fan spinning above me and the sounds of the street drifting up through the open window. $4,500. For the children's school enrollment fees. That's what she told me they needed. And I gave it without hesitation, because that's what you do when you believe in someone. That's what you do when someone has made you feel, for the first time in years, that your presence on this earth still has a purpose. I want you to understand that before I tell you everything else. I want you to understand that I wasn't a foolish man. I was a teacher for 38 years. I taught 7th and 8th grade history in a small town outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. I spent nearly 4 decades watching young people grow up, helping them think critically, teaching them to question what they're told. I prided myself on that, and none of it saved me. Not a single lesson I ever taught protected me from what Rosalind Sanchez did to me over the course of 18 months. $375,000. Gone. Every cent of it built on a lie so carefully constructed that I never once thought to pull at the thread until the whole thing had already unraveled. My wife Carol passed away 3 years before I ever set foot in the Philippines. Pancreatic cancer. We found out in September and she was gone by January. 4 months from diagnosis to burial, and I spent most of those 4 months just trying to understand how something so enormous could move so fast. We'd been married for 31 years. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of every student I'd ever complained about at the dinner table. She'd ask me in March about a kid I'd mentioned in October. That was Carol. When she died, I stopped cooking. I stopped going to church. I stopped answering the phone. My daughter Pamela called every Sunday from Denver, but I let most of those calls go to voicemail because I didn't know what to say to her. I didn't know what to say to anyone. I retired from teaching 8 months after Carol's funeral because I couldn't stand in front of 30 children and talk about anything meaningful when my whole interior life had gone completely silent. I went to the Philippines because a man I'd taught with for 20 years named Bert Halloway had retired there 2 years earlier and couldn't stop sending me emails about how peaceful it was. He said the cost of living was low and the people were warm and the pace of life gave him room to breathe again. I wasn't looking for a woman. I want to be clear about that. I was 64 years old, recently retired, still grieving, and the last thing I was thinking about was romance. I went because I needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of Carol at every turn. Every corner of Tulsa had a memory attached to it. The grocery store where we used to argue about which cereal to buy. The church parking lot where she'd once backed into the pastor's car and made me swear never to tell anyone. The kitchen table where she died holding my hand at 5 a.m. while the sky outside the window was still completely dark. I needed distance from all of that. I needed air. So I packed 2 suitcases and I flew to Manila, and I told myself it was just a trip, just a few months to clear my head. I met Rosalind at a small community center in Quezon City about 6 weeks after I arrived. Bert had introduced me to a loose group of expats who met weekly for coffee, and one of those expats had organized a volunteer day at a local daycare center. I wasn't particularly interested in going, but Bert pushed me, said it would do me good to be around children again, and he was right in the most painful way possible. I spent the morning helping set up tables and arranging art supplies, and Rosalind was the one who came over to thank me. She was 34 years old, slight and quiet-spoken, with the kind of calm in her eyes that I associated with people who had been through something hard and come out steady on the other side. She worked at the daycare. She'd been there for 4 years. She told me she loved working with children because they hadn't learned yet to be unkind to each other. I thought that was a beautiful thing to say. I remember thinking that. She didn't pursue me. That's what I always tell people when they ask me how it started. She didn't come after me. If anything, I came after her. I started showing up at the community center more often than I needed to. I brought books to donate. I helped repaint a storage room. I told myself it was about giving back, about finding purpose in my retirement, but the truth is simpler and more embarrassing than that. I wanted to see her. She made me feel calm in a way I hadn't felt since Carol died. We started having coffee together after the volunteer sessions ended, just the two of us at a small table near the window, talking about her work and my teaching and the way the city moved outside the glass. She was easy to talk to. She listened the way very few people listen, with her full attention, without looking past you or waiting for her turn to speak. I told her about Carol on our third coffee. I hadn't told anyone in the Philippines about Carol yet. It just came out. And Rosalind set down her cup and looked at me and said, "She sounds like someone who loved deeply. That is the rarest kind of person." I went back to my apartment that evening and sat in the dark for a while. Not because I was sad, because something in me had shifted. Some pressure that had been built up for 2 years had released slightly, and I didn't quite know what to do with that feeling. She told me about her children on our 5th or 6th meeting. She said it carefully, as if she was testing whether I would pull away. She had 2 children, she said. A boy named Mateo, who was 9, and a girl named Isabel, who was 6. Their father had left when Isabel was still an infant. Gone to work in Saudi Arabia and never came back, never sent money, never called. She was raising them alone on a daycare worker's salary. She said it without self-pity. That was one of the things that struck me about it. There was no performance of hardship in the way she described it. Just facts, delivered quietly. I asked if it was difficult, and she said yes, but that the children were worth every difficulty. She said Mateo was already reading above his grade level, and that Isabel liked to sing songs she made up herself. Small details. The kind of details that make you believe something without realizing you're being asked to believe it. I believed her completely. I had spent 38 years watching children grow up, and I understood what it meant to pour yourself into a child's future. I understood the particular weight of that responsibility. And I respected her for it in a way that I now understand was exactly the response she was counting on. The first time I gave her money was about 2 months into our friendship. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Mateo's school had sent home a notice about unpaid fees, and that she was worried he might be asked to stop attending. She wasn't asking me for anything. She said it the way you mention something that's on your mind, without expecting the other person to fix it. But I offered. I told her I would help. She refused twice. I want you to know that because I clung to those 2 refusals for a long time afterward as evidence that she hadn't engineered the moment. But I gave her $1,200 and she accepted it with what looked like genuine discomfort. She said she would pay me back. I told her not to think about that. I told her that investing in a child's education was never something to feel ashamed about accepting. I was a teacher. I meant every word. That was the first thread. I didn't see it then. The gifts became more regular over the following months, always framed around the children, school supplies, a medical checkup for Isabel, who Rosalind said had been running a fever for 2 weeks, new uniforms, a contribution toward rent when she said the landlord had raised the price and she couldn't cover the difference. Each request was reasonable on its own. Each amount was manageable. And between the requests, we were building something that felt real and warm and genuinely important to me. We went to meals together. We walked through the parks near her neighborhood. She would sometimes call me in the evenings, and we would talk for an hour about small things. The book she was reading, a funny thing one of the daycare children had said, a memory I'd shared about Carol that she wanted to hear more about. I was falling in love with her. I knew it, and I let it happen, because it had been 2 years since I'd felt anything like it, and I was 64 years old, and I genuinely did not know if I would ever feel it again. She met me at a restaurant to tell me about the housing situation, and the number she quoted was the first time I felt something shift in my stomach without being able to explain why. She said the building where she and the children lived had been sold, and the new owner had given them 60 days to vacate. She'd found a small house in a quieter part of Quezon City, she said, clean and safe, with a yard where Isabel could play. The rent for 1 year up front was the equivalent of $11,000. I sat across from her and looked at her face, and I could not find a single crack in it. She looked tired and worried and steady all at once, the same way she always looked, and I told myself that the feeling in my stomach was just the unfamiliar weight of the number, not anything more significant than that. I gave her $11,000. I transferred it from my savings account into the account she provided, with the calm efficiency of a man who has convinced himself that what he's doing is the right thing. My daughter Pamela called me that same week. She'd been getting more concerned about how much time I was spending in the Philippines, and she asked me directly if I'd met someone. I told her I had a friend who was a local woman, someone who worked with children, someone who had helped me feel less alone. Pamela was quiet for a moment, and then she asked if I was giving this woman money. I told her I had helped with a few expenses related to her children's schooling and housing. Pamela said, "Dad, just that, just my name." The way she said it made me feel the way I used to feel when I knew I was about to have a difficult conversation with a student's parent. Prepared, but not looking forward to it. I told Pamela that I was a grown man, that I had been managing my own finances for 40 years, and that she didn't need to worry. I meant it when I said it. I believed it. There was a man named Ferdy who worked at the coffee shop near the community center where I first met Rosalind. He'd recognized me as a regular, and we'd had dozens of brief conversations over the months, the easy, casual kind that you have with someone who exists at the comfortable edge of your daily life. One afternoon, about 9 months into my relationship with Rosalind, Ferdy asked me how my friend Rosalind was doing. I said she was fine, that she had recently moved into a new house with her children. He nodded, but there was something careful in the nod, something that didn't match the neutral surface of his expression. I almost asked him what he meant, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. I paid for my coffee and I left, and I did not think about the way he'd nodded again until much later, when I was adding up all the moments I had chosen not to see. The medical crisis with Isabel happened around month 11. Rosalind called me early in the morning, her voice tight and quiet, and told me Isabel had been taken to the hospital the night before with severe abdominal pain. She thought it might be appendicitis. They were running tests. The hospital was asking for a deposit before they would continue treatment. She told me the amount was $8,000. I was dressed and at the ATM within 20 minutes. I transferred the money before I'd even had coffee. I didn't ask for documentation. I didn't ask which hospital. I asked only if Isabel was okay, and Rosalind said the doctors were with her and she would let me know as soon as there was news. That evening, she sent me a message saying the tests had come back and it wasn't appendicitis, just a severe gastrointestinal infection, and that Isabel was resting and recovering well. I felt relief so physical that I had to sit down. I remember thinking that this was what it felt like to be a father, to have someone's well-being matter to you more than your own comfort. I had never had children of my own. Carol and I had tried in our early years and it hadn't happened, and eventually we had made peace with that. But in that moment, standing in my apartment, with the message from Rosalind on my phone, I felt something that I can only describe as fatherly. That feeling, more than any other, is the one I am most ashamed of now. Somewhere around month 13, the accumulation of what I'd given started to press against the edges of my awareness in a way I could no longer entirely push aside. I began keeping a loose record in a notebook, not because I was suspicious. I told myself it was just good financial practice. But the act of writing the numbers down one after another changed something in how I held them. They looked different on paper than they had in individual transactions. The school fees across 3 semesters, the housing deposit and first year's rent, the medical expenses, smaller amounts for clothing, for a school trip Mateo was going on, for a tablet so Isabel could do her homework. When I added it all up, I was at $220,000. I stared at the notebook for a long time, and then I closed it and put it in a drawer and went for a walk. Bert Halloway had watched all of this from a respectful distance, the way old friends do when they can see something you can't, but know that pointing at it too directly will only push you further in. He finally said something over dinner one evening, carefully, the way you'd approach a sleeping animal. He said he'd heard something through the expat community. He said someone had mentioned that they knew a daycare worker in the area who had a habit of developing close friendships with older foreign men, and that the relationship usually involved significant financial support. He didn't use Rosalind's name. He just let the description sit on the table between us. I told him I appreciated his concern and that he didn't know the full situation. He nodded and said he understood, and he dropped it. I drove home that night running arguments through my head, constructing reasons why what he described had nothing to do with Rosalind, why she was different, why our connection was real, why I was not the man in that story. I was very thorough. I built a very complete case, and none of it was true. The gathering happened in month 16, the event I could not argue my way around, the crack that became a collapse. One of the long-term expats in Quezon City organized a casual dinner at his home, a relaxed gathering of foreign residents and their Filipino friends and colleagues. Rosalind came with me. She had met a few of the expats before and was comfortable at these things, easy in conversation and warm without being performative. About an hour into the evening, a Filipino couple arrived whom I hadn't met before. The woman's name was Cora, and when she saw Rosalind across the room, her face changed in a way that was involuntary and immediate, the kind of expression that you can't manufacture and can't suppress. It was recognition, genuine and complicated, with something underneath it that I didn't have a word for at the time. Cora and Rosalind greeted each other with the measured politeness of two people who have a history and have agreed, without saying so, to keep it contained. I ended up next to Cora's husband, a quiet man named Amos. Later in the evening, when we were both standing near the food table, we talked about nothing important for a few minutes, and then Amos asked how I knew Rosalind. I said we were close friends. He nodded, the same careful nod I'd seen from Ferdy at the coffee shop, and I felt the same preemptive tightening in my chest. He said, "She is a lovely woman. My wife has known her since childhood." I said that was nice, that it was good she had old friends nearby. He looked at his drink for a moment and then he said, "I didn't know she was telling people she had children." I heard the sentence, but my brain didn't immediately process what it meant. I asked him to repeat it. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "Rosalind doesn't have children. She never had children. Cora would know. They grew up together. She has no children." I stood very still. The noise of the gathering continued around me, voices and laughter and someone's music from a small speaker on the shelf, and I stood in the middle of all of it with Amos's words arranging themselves into a shape I recognized but couldn't yet accept. I didn't confront her that night. I drove her home in almost complete silence, and she didn't press me on it, which later struck me as telling. If she'd been innocent, she would have asked what was wrong. Instead, she looked out the window and said goodnight at her door with the same steady calm she always had. And I drove back to my apartment, and I sat at the kitchen table until 3 a.m. with my notebook open in front of me. $340,000 by that point. I went through every transaction, every explanation she had given me, every story about Mateo reading above grade level, every detail about Isabel singing songs she made up herself. And I understood with a clarity that was physically painful that I had never met these children, not once in 16 months. She had always had an explanation. Mateo had a school event. Isabel was at her grandmother's. The timing was never right. I had never pushed because I had trusted her, because pushing would have implied I didn't trust her, and I had been so determined to be the kind of man who trusts. I went to see her the next morning. I didn't call ahead. I knocked on the door of the house that I had paid for, and she answered in the calm, unhurried way she did everything, and she looked at my face and she knew. She didn't try to run through a story or manufacture surprise. She stepped aside and let me in, and we sat at the kitchen table that I had also paid for, and I asked her to tell me the truth. She did. She told me all of it in the same quiet voice she'd used to tell me about her invented children. She had no children. She never had children. The school fees I'd paid had gone to her sister's clothing business. The house was in her mother's name and her family lived there. The medical emergency for Isabel had never happened. The hospital, the tests, the recovery entirely fabricated. She had known from the second or third time we met that I was the kind of man who responded to need, who organized his sense of self around being useful and being needed. She had given me the thing she knew I would pay the most for, which was a purpose that felt like teaching an investment in the future of children I believed in. She had given me the feeling of being a father figure, and I had paid her $375,000 for it. I asked her if any of it had been real for her. She looked at me across the table for a long moment and she said, "I was not unkind to you. That was real." I don't know what she expected me to do with that. I sat with it for a moment and I said, "You told me your daughter liked to sing songs she made up herself." She looked down at the table. She didn't say anything. That was when I stood up and walked out of the house and got into my car and drove back to my apartment and called Pamela. My daughter flew from Denver to Manila within 48 hours. I want to say something about Pamela that I think is important. She was furious, and she had every right to be, but she never once said, "I told you so." Not a single time in the weeks that followed, when we were sitting together going through the documentation of what I'd lost and trying to understand what could realistically be recovered. She just came. She showed up at my door with 2 suitcases and a look on her face that said she would not leave until she was sure I was going to be all right, and she meant it. Whatever failures I may have had as a father in the years when she was growing up, I did something right because the person she became showed up for me without hesitation at the lowest point of my life, and I have never been more grateful for anything. We consulted a lawyer in Manila, a woman named Ati Villanueva, who handled financial fraud cases involving foreign nationals. She was direct and thorough, and she told me what I already suspected, that the money I had transferred voluntarily, in good faith, with no formal loan documentation, was almost impossible to recover through legal channels. She said I could file a complaint, that there might be a case for estafa under Philippine law given the deliberate deception, but that the practical likelihood of recovering the funds was low. I filed the complaint anyway, not because I expected anything from it, but because I needed to say, on record, what had been done to me. In the weeks after Pamela went home, I did a great deal of sitting alone and thinking about the specific architecture of what had happened. Not just what Rosalind had done, but how completely I had cooperated with it. I had wanted, with a desperation I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself, to be needed in the way a father is needed. Carol and I had wanted children, and it hadn't happened, and I had spent 38 years pouring that particular love into other people's children in my classroom, and when Carol died, the outlet for that love had gone quiet. Rosalind had found the exact shape of the opening and filled it precisely. She had been intelligent about me in a way that I find, even now, both impressive and devastating. She had not simply taken money. She had studied what I needed and given it back to me as a performance, and I had paid her to keep performing it. I also thought a great deal about the moments I had chosen not to see. Ferdy's careful nod at the coffee shop, Bert's measured warning over dinner, Pamela's one-word response when I told her I was giving money to a local woman, Amos at the gathering, looking at his drink before he said what he said. The fact that in 16 months I had never once met the children who were at the center of every financial decision I made. Every one of those moments had been available to me. I had looked directly at each of them and chosen the interpretation that kept the story I was living intact. That was not Rosalind's failure. That was mine. I don't say that to let her off the hook. What she did was a deliberate, systematic fraud. But I have learned the hard way that you cannot be deceived at that scale without a certain amount of cooperation from the part of you that would rather believe a beautiful lie than face an ugly truth. Bert came to see me a few weeks. After everything came out, he didn't say much. He sat with me on the small balcony of my apartment, and we drank coffee and watched the street below, and after a while he said, "You fell in love with an idea." I thought about that. It was close to accurate, but not entirely right. I fell in love with the version of myself she made possible, the man who was still useful, still capable of providing, still somebody's anchor. When that version of me turned out to be built on fiction, I didn't just lose the money. I lost the self I had been borrowing for 16 months, and I had to figure out what was underneath it. I flew back to Oklahoma 5 months after that dinner party. I wasn't ready to go home in any emotional sense, but I understood that staying wasn't going to give me what I was waiting for. My apartment in Quezon City had become a place I associated entirely with loss, and I needed walls around me that held a different kind of memory. Pamela had offered to have me stay with her in Denver, and I seriously considered it, but in the end I went back to Tulsa because there was something I needed to face there that I had been running from for 3 years. Not just Carol's absence. The life I had left behind when she died, the friends I hadn't called, the neighbors I had stopped waving to, the church I had stopped attending. The whole ordinary fabric of a life that I had let go ragged at the edges because grief had made me unable to tend to it. I am 66 years old as I write this. I lost $375,000, which was the majority of my retirement savings beyond my pension and Social Security. I live more carefully now. I cook my own meals, and I pay my own bills, and I do not wire money to anyone for any reason without documentation and reflection, and usually a conversation with Pamela first. I went back to teaching not full-time, but as a substitute, 2 or 3 days a week at the same school district where I worked for 38 years. The school was happy to have me. Some of the teachers on staff are people I taught when they were my students. There is something clarifying about that, about watching the work you did continue to grow in directions you didn't entirely plan. I didn't expect it to make me feel better, but it does. I don't hate Rosalind Sanchez. I've thought about whether I should, and I've decided I don't. What she did was wrong and deliberate, and it hurt me in ways I'm still sorting through. But I understand now that people who do what she did are not operating from the same emotional framework that I bring to the world, and hatred is a response that assumes a kind of equivalence that isn't there. She found someone vulnerable and she used him, and she was skilled at it in a way that suggests I was probably not the first. That thought is sad to me in a way that has nothing to do with my own situation. Wherever she is, whatever story she is telling to whatever man has come after me, I hope at some point she runs out of the energy it takes to maintain that kind of performance. I hope she gets tired. Not for my sake, just because that kind of life must be exhausting in ways she would never admit to. What I carry forward from this, beyond the financial loss and the shame and the very difficult phone calls, is something I didn't expect to find in the rubble of it. I understand myself better than I did before. I know now exactly how deep the need for purpose runs in me, how quietly and completely it had been driving decisions that I believed were rational. I know now that grief can hollow out a person in ways they don't recognize, and that the hollow space will pull toward whatever offers to fill it, and that the wisdom is not in having no needs but in being honest about what you need and careful about who you let near it. That is not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. But it is a real thing, and I have spent enough of my life, 38 years of it, trying to teach people the value of real things over comfortable ones. I suppose it was time I learned it myself. The children Mateo and Isabel never existed, but the love I was capable of feeling for them that was real, the instinct that made me want to protect them and invest in their futures and be someone they could count on that was real. She took something that was genuinely good in me and built a fiction around it, but the thing itself was real. And at 66, having lost more than I can easily recover and more than I know how to fully forgive, that is what I hold on to, not as comfort, exactly, but as proof that the person I thought I was is still somewhere underneath all of this, still here, still trying to figure out what to do with himself, still, in spite of everything, capable of believing that something can be worth it. I'm just a great deal more careful now about what I decide to believe.